Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to our walk through the Bible. Thank you for joining us. And those who'll catch it later, thank you for catching it. Tonight, we're just going to do a quick review. This is day 84, and we are reviewing Joshua, the ninth through the 11th chapter. And we're going to get started. I think it's about 8:30 or something like that. So I know you're probably getting settled and trying to get things together for the next day. So let's start uh, Joshua, the ninth chapter. This is dealing with the campaign where they took the southern territory. The way these three chapters are broken up, the ninth chapter, the first verse through the 10th chapter and the 43rd verse deals with what is called the Southern Campaign. And the Northern Campaign deals with uh, the 11th chapter, the first verse through the 15th verse. And the 11th chapter, the 16th verse through the 23rd, talks about Joshua taking the whole land. And we find that it deals with a lot of the battles that Joshua went through. And let's talk about the ninth chapter. They were dealing with different kings that had gathered together because they heard about what God was doing with Israel through Joshua. And once the people of Gibeon heard what God had done through them to Jericho and to the city of Ai, these group of kings decided in verse 4, hey, we're going to get a plan together and we're going to make up a story and pretend that we're ambassadors, and we're going to go to Joshua and try to get them to make a treaty with us, which would have been okay if they were honest about it. But what these group of people did, they actually came to Joshua at Gilgal. And we know that Gilgal, and if you don't know, Gilgal stands for a place of victory. And when they got there in the seventh verse, they told the men of Israel, hey, we came from a far country. We're tired. And they went so far as to even put on dirt on their clothes. They made their shoes to look worn out. They even had food that had gotten dry, was molded, and they actually made it look like they came from a far distance. So, in that ninth chapter, verse 1 through 15, we see that they're putting on this big performance for Joshua, and they were so convincing that they got away with it. And the reason they got away with it, when they first, let me go back, is something I want to point out to you. When they first got there, and it was in, okay, let's go to verse 8. When they said to Joshua, we're your servants, and Joshua said, well, who are you and where did you come from? That's when they gave them this big story saying that they had come from far away. And what they did was they said, look, we heard about what God has done through you. And look at us. They, in verse 11, they were telling them, look, Our bread is dry, it's molded down in verse 12. And they even said, look, our wine was new and now it's old. And they just went through this elaborate thing. But what I want to point out in verse 15, let me face this way. In verse 15, it says Joshua made peace with them and made a league with them to let them live. And the princes of the congregation, meaning the elders, swear unto them. This was an unholy alliance. Why did they get deceived? Because they did not seek God before they made that covenant. That's why when we move, when we make decisions, we should always seek God. And what is the big deal about them making this covenant? Well, once Israel made a covenant, they could not go back on that covenant. So it was really critical. They made a decision to give these people a treaty because you ever heard the expression, your word is your bond? When they made this covenant, they were bound to be at peace with these people and to come to their rescue if they got in trouble. So when you make decisions and you don't seek God, you can cause a plethora of trouble just by that one action. And let's jump down to verse 16. It came to pass at the end of 3 days after the treaty was made and the people dwelt among them that the truth came out. And when the truth came out, the children of Israel in verse 18 couldn't smite them because the princes of the congregation, the leaders, made that alignment, and all the congregation murmured against the princes. You know, sometimes we know that if you've been in church and you hear people murmuring against decisions that are made. So that's exactly what happened here. We see that because they made this alliance in verse 21, the princes said to the people as they were complaining, they said, hey, we have to let them live because we made this alliance. But all things will work together for your good even when you mess up. So in verse 21, we see the consequences that the Gibeonites had to suffer. They ended up becoming slaves. The princess said in verse 21, let them live, but they will be hewers of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, which means they became bound as service Israel. And Joshua says to them in 22, hey, why did you deceive us saying that you came from so far away? And now you're cursed. You will not be free from bondage. And what they did in verse 24, they started making excuses, but in their mind, it was a rationale and it was justified because they said, look, in verse 24, they told Joshua, we were told how the Lord commanded Moses to give you all the land and destroy the inhabitants before you. And because of this, we were afraid. So we decided to we plotted so that basically what they were saying down to verse 26. We were trying to stay alive, man. Look, we heard about what your God did for you. We heard about the other people that you beat down and wiped out, and we were just trying to stay alive. That's what we were trying to do. So that's why we came up with this elaborate scheme. And Joshua said, well, look, from that day to this day, you're going to be servants. That is your consequence for deceiving us. And down in chapter 10, now we have another group of kings that have heard about Gibeon making an alignment with Joshua. And it was upsetting to them because Gibeon was a bigger city with bigger resources and a more powerful army than they had. And they felt like, wait a minute, if Gibeon made a treaty with Joshua and they're much bigger than us, then we're going to have to come together because that's going to be the only way we survive. So we see here in verse 3, this is an example of the enemy trying to overshadow you by coming together, pooling their forces. Verse 5 points out who those 5 kings were. And they encamped around Gibeon and they began to make war. And we see in verse 6, the men of Gibeon sent Joshua a message down to Gilgal and said, look, don't slack, which means, hey, don't play around. We need help and we need help now. And because the people of Israel had made this treaty with the people of Gibeon, they had no choice but to come to their defense. So Joshua and all the men of war, all the mighty men of valor, they got together and they began to go down to their rescue. And we see Joshua, they came forth and God he guaranteed them victory. In verse 8, the Lord said to Joshua, fear them not, for I have delivered them into your hands. Not one of them will stand before thee. And he suddenly went out up from Gilgal at night. And it's important because that at that night, you see that it was an all-night march from Gilgal to Gibeon. And that was a mountainous territory. It was rugged, and the men had a uphill march. Now, our brothers and sisters in the military can attest. When you go to war, you're not just going on a regular hike. You got stuff on your back. You are loaded down with your weapons. You're loaded down with provisions. You're loaded down with a lot of stuff. So it's significant that in their pursuit to get to Gibeon, these men went uphill, rugged terrain, about 20 miles with all of the gear on their back, and they did not stop. They went as fast as they could to get to the aid of Gideon. And what I want to point out, it was in verse 11 that I'm sorry, go back to verse 10. As they got there, they chased the people, the 5 kingdoms. They began to fight, and there was a great slaughter. And as they fled from Israel and they were going down, the Lord began to send great stones. And when you look that up, it was actually like great hailstones that God allowed to come and rain down on them. So actually, it says in verse 11, God killed more of the enemy as they ran than the Israels did. And what this is an example of is God taking care of the enemy that comes against you. And we find Joshua in verse 12 in this very famous scripture. We find him actually telling the sun to stand still upon Gibeon and the moon to stay in the valley of Ajalon. Now, this, a lot of scholars have explained that there was a slowing down or a stopping of the earth on its axis. Some say it was a special refraction of the sun's rays. Other scholars have said it was a solar eclipse or it was the massive hailstone. But the bottom line is whatever God used to make the sun stand still, we see supernatural intervention in Joshua's battle. This is an example of God letting the children of Israel know that I am your God. And if I have to move heaven or earth, if I have to suspend the laws of nature, I will remember the scripture, I'll never leave you, I'll never forsake you. So this is an example. No matter what we are going through or where we find ourselves, we have an example in Joshua 12 that God will move heaven or earth to make sure his people are victorious. So I love that scripture so much. That is a scripture that you need to memorize and keep in your arsenal. God will move or suspend the laws of nature to make sure you come out victorious in every situation. So that we see here, God intervened. He gave them supernatural intervention. And in verse 16, the five kings actually fled and hid themselves in a cave. So you got the kings who started this fight. These jokers actually ran and hid in a cave. So we see here that God will chase your enemy and instill so much fear that the enemy will run into a cave. And we see Joshua, he pursues them. He gets the kings, he brings them out. I'm sorry, before he did that, Joshua had the men move stones in front of the cave. And as he did that, then he pursued the rest of the people who were on the run. And as they took him in verse 20, he comes back in 22 and they remove the stone and they bring the kings out. And in verse 24, he has the men of Israel put their feet on the necks of the king. This was a representation of surrender. Remember, the word tells us that the enemy should be under our feet. at all times. And that is why when the scripture talks about the armor of God, we have armor for every part of our body except our back. Why? Because the enemy should never see our back. He should be under our feet. So I'm going to wrap this up because the rest of this book deals with all of the different kings and cities that Joshua and the people conquered and overtook and dealt with. This is a great book. And we're going to wrap that up. Thank you for joining us. And those who catch us later, thank you. We will see you Sunday in service. Well, tomorrow's Thursday. So we'll see you for 6 a.m. prayer. And then have a great evening.